Welcome back to another episode of Impossible Equals Impossible. I know it's been a minute. I took a couple weeks away to spend time with my family for Thanksgiving, but we have, including this episode, only three more episodes left until it's the end of 2023. And I'm so excited for the guests that I have tonight. You know, when my co-host and I originally, or I should say my ex-co-host and I originally created this show, it was to tell the entire story, right? So many times when we're on social media, a lot of people want to share with you things that they want you to see, right? Usually it's a lot of the wins, not really so much a lot of the challenges and obstacles that you've had to overcome to when you to get to that point of where you are. And the interesting thing about it is when I had really hopped on LinkedIn and became a creator, there were a lot of people who were experiencing kind of the darkest times of their life, right? Whether it was layoffs, whether it was medical issues. Tanya, so great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. Or really just any challenge that maybe people haven't experienced before. And one of the things that I wanted to do was talk about these difficult conversations, right? Bring on people who have maybe been where you are, and not saying that because they've overcome it means that you should, but it's just the power of possibility, right? I know for me and my experience and how it's played out in my life, possibility for me has been an absolute game changer. It's allowed me to do things that I didn't think were possible. And the ultimate goal with it was to inspire others to chase their potential instead of accepting their reality. And I, the, the guest that we have tonight is literally the epitome of that. We'll tune in to that story when we bring her on. But I want to just share with you all a bit about my guest tonight, Kathy Leckey. So my guest is Kathy Leckey. Kathy has become an incredible friend who has rebuilt her life from the ground up. Kathy was originally born and raised in Buffalo, New York, and she's a Bills fan. You know, for a lot of you football fanatics out there, that currently resides on the shoreline of Connecticut, spending most of her free time near the beach. Kathy is also a TEDx speaker, contributing author in the Standing O book series, coach of healing from codependency. She's an entrepreneur, a mother to three incredible children, and she's coached hundreds of classes focused on self-care. And ultimately, she realized that it's so important to have a place or a program, a journal, some of the things that she has that can put everything together in one place. And she has become an absolute incredible friend. Lance, so good to see you. Ari, so great to see you. We had a great conversation. So with no further ado, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to bring on somebody who has become an absolute dear friend of mine. We've had an incredible conversations. Welcome to the show, Kathy Leckey. Kathy, thank you so much for being here. I am so excited for our conversation tonight, you know, the power of choice and self-care, but I want to start this off with a question, right? I'm sure that you're probably very familiar with. Tell us a little bit about who is Kathy Leckey, and kind of give us maybe like a brief kind of synopsis of how you got to kind of where you are today.
It's a very long story, Paul. I'm glad that I'm here to talk to you tonight. We definitely won't get through all of it, but just as a start, I did grow up in Buffalo. I went to school to be a teacher, and I was an elementary school teacher for almost 10 years once I moved here to Connecticut. And I left teaching and went into business with my now ex-husband. So taught myself a lot about entrepreneurship. And then we went through it, which is something that we'll talk about at some point. And now I have, at this point, really proved that the impossible is possible, because when we went through it, that was not, I wasn't entirely sure that it was possible. So you are welcome to dig into any parts, but it's the that tough part, I guess, that got me where I am now.
Yeah, it's so amazing, right? Because what's and I'm curious on your thoughts on this, right? So many times when we're kind of going through the storm, as I like to call it, right? It's so hard to kind of see yourself while you're like in it. And it's only really when you overcome it and you look back like, wow, like it's been so incredible. And I've only known you for a short while. I think maybe like a little over 6 months, but we've become like wonderful friends. We've had multiple conversations. It seems like we see each other every week, right? Through our community events.
Yeah.
And really, I was really blown away by your TEDx talk, not necessarily because of the magnitude of, oh, it was a TEDx talk, but because of the way that you had kind of started it, right? I feel like you were kind of leaning towards the route that so many people on social media tend to talk about themselves, right? Which is in the best light, all the accolades, all the wins. And then you had kind of talked about the a lot of the tragedy that you experienced, and how I love that you said that I'm going to tell you the truth, because the truth is that it's really both of it. And I'm really curious for you, right? How has what you experienced, right, that tough part that you've really had to kind of build into the grit and really make a lot of difficult choices for yourself, how has that really kind of molded you into the person that you are today? And just like, if there's anybody out there in the audience who maybe has experienced some of the things that you have, whether it was like you said, divorce, or we'll obviously learn more about the story, but you basically rebuilt your life kind of from the ground up, basically started over, did all these type of things. What are like two or three things that you would share with them that you had wished that you had kind of known on your journey?
So I think it's a good idea just to give a little bit of the backstory, because sometimes people tend to see us where we are today and not understand where we've come from. It was about 10 years ago. Um, we had I had a beautiful little family here in Connecticut, um, and life looked and seemed like it was going really well. And through a series of events, my now ex-husband ended up going to prison. And at that time, when he left, I was then the sole parent, breadwinner for the family. It was the most devastating thing that I could have never imagined going through. I remember the day that he left for prison, just laying in my bed thinking there was just absolutely no way I was going to be able to do this on my own. The truth was, I was never on my own. That was one lesson that I learned, is that there were always people, family, friends, strangers. There were always people there to support me and my kids through the following years after that. And a lot of them came from the relationships that I had built, up until then. And a lot of them came through new relationships and people who knew how hard we were working, and what we were going through. So I would say I was overwhelmed by the feeling of being alone, but in reality, I was never really alone. The other thing is knowing that everything is temporary. So the really high highs and the really low lows are still equally temporary. And having that perspective and that understanding that things were temporary would have been very it would have been helpful at that time because each stage was so grueling and each stage was devastating in its own way.
Yeah.
But I learned over time that we never stayed in one of those places. And the third most important thing that I learned, which is what has brought me here today, is that at the time that I did the TED Talk, at the time that he went to prison, at the time I was doing all of these things, and I had to I started a brand new career that I had never done before. We moved to a different city that I had not lived in before. The kids were all in different schools and, lots of stuff going on, that I was really strong. And I heard that from people all the time. I don't know how you're doing it. I was still smiling. I was getting all the kids to practices, definitely with help, but I was getting it done. And I was sleeping at night, and people would say, I don't know how you sleep at night. I don't know how you're doing it. And it wasn't until a few years later when I started to learn about, and once you start to learn about it, you heal from codependency, and learned how my own behaviors, beliefs, and thoughts were codependent, and that was a big part of the relationships and the situations that I was in. That's when my true healing started. And that's what has led me to write the book and to be doing the coaching. But I didn't know the difference at the time. So when we were going through it, I thought I was really strong. And I thought that was a good thing. The hits just kept coming and I'd keep, getting up. And I thought that was a good thing. Now I know that healthy is so much more important, and I know what that means now. So
Yeah,
those
it's
are three big things.
it blows me away hearing you say that, because it reminds me of probably one of the most powerful things that I heard, because a lot of people like to talk about trauma, but they try to do it without kind of actually going through a lot of the pain, right? And like feeling it, thinking that there's another way. And I feel like we can't heal what we aren't willing to feel. And that has been my experience, and numerous other, I haven't really met anybody that has said otherwise. So I love that you shared that. And before we move on to the conversation, I want to say hello to some people who hopped in. Ari, thank you so much for being here. If you haven't, definitely connect with Kathy. She has an incredible story as well. I would say that Ari is definitely an outlier. Lance, so good to see you. Thanks for stopping in. Tanya, so good to see you as well. And Omar and Victoria. I don't believe that we've met, but I know that you must be a friend of Kathy's, and she's here to support you, Kathy.
She's now a fellow outlier with you. She joined the
Oh,
Outlier
awesome.
Project with us in the last couple of weeks, and she's wonderful.
Exciting. Well, we'll have to connect, Victoria. And Shelly, my friend from Australia. You'll definitely love Kathy as well. The part that was so fascinating to me is, I love the part about your kids, right? We kind of covered it briefly. You have three kids, right? Just want to confirm.
They're all adults at this point,
Yeah.
early
And
20s.
when I was listening to that TED talk, they were younger at the time. I think one was like 6, 8, and a little older, the oldest.
Right.
And you were basically talking about how they were entrepreneurs, right? I want to kind of know a bit, how did that kind of happen? Like, was there any influence from like your side, or how did that necessarily kind of happen? Because it's always so fascinating to see the younger ones become entrepreneurs, and especially because at that age, right? Like, how in the heck can you figure out like, oh, I have a business and I didn't even know about it? So I'd love to kind of know more about that story.
It happened very organically. It really just happened, and I think that having the and just sharing in the excitement. So we were driving in the car one day. My son had a book in his hand. He was 8 years old. It was the almanac of record, I can't remember what it was. It was an almanac of like interesting facts. And he spouted out a fact about how people were dying from not having clean drinking water. And there was a picture of a life straw. And he said, they only cost $5. And like, that's nothing, even to an 8-year-old, right? Like, that's nothing. He knew. And he said, maybe, we can figure this out. And so he put together, so it was just that conversation, which led to asking the school principal if he can put up a table at one of the school fairs. And honestly, for me, I was so afraid. He kept asking me, would you ask my principal for permission? And I said, of course I will. I was terrified to do it. I was terrified. That was the old, and so I remember writing this email and clicking send and she said, of course, that would be great. And so he made his own posters and he put together his own little thing. And of course, with my help, and we had fun doing that. So we sat at this table and we talked to people and people were interested in it. And there happened to be a gentleman there who was in the Rotary Club. And he came over and he said, we'd love to have you as a guest at the Rotary Club if you could do that. And so we had never done anything like that before. So we went home and we put together, and I let him do a PowerPoint. I let him put it together, and he put together this hilarious PowerPoint from an 8-year-old's perspective. And we started at one Rotary Club, which led to the next, which led to the next. So what I'm saying is it started with a conversation, just him being interested in something. And we just kept following it until it became what it was. And then my other two saw what we were doing and wanted to be involved, and they figured out their own way to do that.
That's so cool. I love that story because so many times, like when we're talking about entrepreneurship, I don't think that a lot of people understand that most people aren't really born entrepreneurs. You go the employee route, right? Like you work for somebody else and you kind of realize like, yeah, this is not for me. I want to kind of do my own thing. That was how I started, and a lot of other people that I've connected with in my network, that tends to be the place for them. So I'm always curious how that happens like so organically at that age, because at that age, like they're not concerned about working or any of these type of things. And it's just so cool, going back to this idea of self-awareness and the power of choice. I remember the conversation that you and I had. We had an incredible first conversation, exchanging stories and all these type of things. And a big part of our conversation was about self-awareness and how I believe, just speaking from my experience, right, I was probably existing asleep for most of my life than I was actually living awake, alive, intentionally, and with purpose. And I'm kind of curious for you, one, was that your experience as well as you were going through a lot of the, we'll say, like low points on the journey? And what was really kind of that turning point for you that allowed you to like really flip the switch? I know in the TED talk you had talked about like three main pillars, and I don't want to spoil it for everybody, but you talked about perspective, what you want, and then ultimately like taking action to what are you going to do to kind of do it. And I would just love to kind of know more about that, on your perspective on that.
Yeah, I definitely used the perspective and the vision during the depths of it, believing that I was going through all of this for a reason, and that I would be able to help other people by being the model of how you can get through tough things, which kept me going. The problem was, I did do that, but part of the problem was that, yes, I was still asleep to a lot of, when I said before that I was really strong, it was because I was too afraid to feel the feelings. And so I was strong in holding them back, which doesn't mean that I didn't cry. And I mean, I was very emotionally upset, but I didn't know what to do with it. And so I was strong. So what happened was, let's say, I don't know, years later, after the divorce, I was a single mom, 5 years, and I thought I was being very picky about who to get into a relationship with. And I met someone who checked all the boxes for me, and I thought that this is what I had been waiting for. And very quickly, a few months into it, I realized that this person was really toxic, really unhealthy, really unsafe. And that I was devastated by it. I felt like I was falling apart. And that is the experience that made me say, I cannot experience this again. I cannot go through this again. And I am following some kind of a pattern here that I don't know what it is. But the only common denominator in all of these stories is me. And that is what led me to learn about toxic relationships, narcissistic behaviors, the connection with people who have codependent behaviors, and how that dynamic works. And I identified very clearly with that. The waking up part was really scary because I was in my late 40s, and this was all I had known my whole life, was these unhealthy thoughts and behaviors, feeling not good enough, staying in a relationship for the wrong reasons, which were security, love, validation, that I, at the time, wasn't able to give to myself. And I was looking for someone else to provide those for me. And so when I woke up and realized what was happening, it was so overwhelming. The best part about that is that I learned that just one thing will heal everything, and that is self-care. That is reconnecting to yourself, or connecting for the first time to yourself, and practicing true self-care, which is not the massages and getting nails done, but expressing yourself, telling yourself the truth, being able to trust yourself, forgive yourself. That is true self-care. And once I or others start practicing that kind of self-care, everything else takes care of itself.
Yeah, wow, what a powerful share. I was going to ask you another question, but I want to kind of dive into this self-care topic. So, I'm kind of curious for you, like, how do you see the difference between self-care and self-love? Because for me, just from my perspective, obviously this is something that you've been practicing, you've taught hundreds of classes, and you've worked with many clients. I look at it as kind of how I look at motivation versus inspiration. One is kind of um like a temporary solution, whereas one is like a lifetime type of thing. When you look at motivation, it runs out eventually, whereas inspiration is something that people will say will last a lifetime. I'm interested on your perspective between self-care versus self-love, because I find that the times that people practice like self-care it's like a temporary thing, but yet we're going to spend the most time with ourselves more than anything. So we are the most important relationship that we have. Like I like to say, 365, 24/7. Like, you're always with yourself. I'm kind of curious, like, from your area of expertise and your experience, how do you kind of look at that?
I don't look at them separately at all. I believe if you have self-love, you will practice self-care automatically. And if you are practicing self-care, you will learn to love yourself and have that self-love. So they go hand in hand. And the reason I said self-care, not the massages and getting your nails done, is because even when I was going through it, the common thing I would hear was, well, go get a massage. I know you're really stressed out. Go get a massage. And I would. And for that 90 minutes, it was bliss. And then I would walk out the door. My phone would ring. A kid was sick. I had to run to soccer practice to pick somebody up. And it was like it had never happened before. So going for a massage is a wonderful thing. I believe in it for health reasons, mental health reasons. But when I talk about self-care, it is staying present. Self-care is using your breath. Self-care is learning how to soothe yourself, how to entertain yourself when you're bored so that you're not turning to other distractions, addictions, people, whatever that is. Self-care is being able to come out of denial, which is that sleep you were talking about. It's the ability to set healthy boundaries for ourselves. So self-care for me is work. It's not just a fun go out with the girls night. That's a part of it. But when I talk about self-care with the people who I work with, it's more about what can I do every single day, every minute, using my breath, just staying present. That is self-care. And you have to love yourself enough to do that for yourself. And if you don't, when you first start, because a lot of people don't, they're mad at themselves. They're worried that they're never going to change. There's lots of negative feelings. They're not forgiving themselves for the behaviors that they did in the past. I did things I'm not proud of. I was distracting myself with alcohol, people. Like I should have been home more. There were lots of things that I'm not happy with, but I know exactly where I was at the time, and I forgive myself for that. I do not torture myself over, a lot of people, what brings them to tears, which is what I was just about to say, is when we look back, we can see damage that we might have done to our kids. And that is painful. But what I've learned is that for my kids, at least, they learned more from me and my healing than they did in the years of the dysfunction that they saw.
Yeah, that's powerful. I just want to say, like, this is how experience is like so valuable, because the way that you explain self-care and self-love isn't really something that I've heard before. I've heard people hearing your explanation, I can see how it's kind of like one and the same, because one is kind of like the building block, right? Where you would kind of start, and then one's ultimately like the end goal, but they interact, because if you don't have self-care, like what if you don't know what self-love is, right? You have to start somewhere. So one's kind of the starting point versus where you want to get. And it's interesting because we have some people in the audience. Kathy, I'm not sure if you're connected with my friend Christine, but she said that she's going through the same problems that you're going through, and she said that she's a late bloomer. So I think a lot of the insight and advice that you shared was powerful for her. And she has something here I want to share. I don't know if it's going to pop up, so let's see. Oh yeah, cut off a bit, but I'll just read it. It says, so sometimes people tell me to get a massage. Once I was staying overnight at a hotel for business, and someone made that suggestion. I responded that I was just happen to get a break from my kids and spouse and be alone in a clean space, shower, and eat a meal alone in my room, rest, and listen to an audiobook. Heaven. It was just what the doctor ordered. And I love that you said too that it differs for everybody, right? Because maybe like some of the things that work for you may not work for me, or like may not work for Christine or Tanya or any of these people. this for me was probably, I would say, one of my biggest aha moments. And I know in every conversation that you and I've had one to one, it's always something that we talk about. But the power of choice. I remember when I had first started training with a mentor, she had told me that you are one conversation, connection, decision, action away from a completely different life. And what was interesting is I remember at the first conversation that we had where you and I were kind of just getting to know each other, exchange stories, we had talked about that we didn't realize that inaction was a choice. For me, I think 17 when I kind of got my coming of age moment, and I looked at it as like there was no other option, because I was like, and then somebody told me years and years later, well, but there was an option. Like, you could have chose to do nothing, and doing nothing is a choice. And I'm kind of curious for you, like, because you had talked about in the TEDx, you had talked about how you had gone from kind of victim to now like being a victor. And I feel like one of the things that a lot of people kind of get misconstrued when you're storytelling and when you're sharing like your true, like, full story, is the fact that everybody who's been a victor has been a victim at some point. Everybody who you see as a thriver has had to learn to survive. And I'm kind of curious for you, like, how was that incorporated in your story?
Well, just like Christine said, it's better to be a late bloomer than not bloom at all. Um, Everybody has a choice to start down this path. And sometimes it's out of curiosity or some kind of just feeling that there's more or that they're interested in it. And then sometimes it's from these big situations that happen to us. Some are we're in our control and some were not. Um, it took me a little bit of time to realize that I had a choice. My initial go-to was that, of course, I would be the victim. That was just, there was no question about it. I believed I was a victim of circumstance. And so I behaved like one. And, but for me, it didn't feel right. It just didn't feel good. There was enough of me that remembered who I was, and um, that I was capable, that I could actually take steps to change the things that I didn't like and learn about things and do the hard things. One thing I was always worried about was that there was going to be something that came along that just kind of leveled me. And once I kept going through all of these different things that kept coming, I finally figured out that there was nothing that was going to take me out. And that moment was a moment of freedom. It was such a relief. It was like, I don't have to be afraid anymore. Life, I know now, is going to keep coming. And so I know that I can handle it, whatever it is. And that comes from the choice in what perspective am I going to take on this? Is this happening to me, or is this happening for me to learn some kind of a lesson? Am I going to be angry and bitter, or am I going to be grateful for everything else that is, in my life? And so choice, I think the choice of perspective is like the first and most important thing. And then from there, it's the choice of how you show up every day. Um, it's well, it is a it's a constant choice. So I have to, we're talking about things that have happened in the past. I find every day noticing opportunities where I am making a conscious choice of how to respond to things, whereas in the past I might have just reacted. So it's, you practice these things. That's why, because then they become a little bit easier and quicker as your response. But if you see my name on the screen, it says Kathy Love. And I recently have changed my last name to about maybe 3 months ago. I haven't done it legally yet. I'm waiting until with the Outlier Project, we're going on our humanitarian trip in February to Nicaragua. So I don't want to mess around with my passport. But after that, I'll officially change it. And what happened was my now ex-husband sent me a message that was not very nice. And he said that I was disparaging the Leckey name, and that I was in effect harming my children. And because I was doing this coaching and I was talking about our story, that I was disparaging the Leckey name. I was devastated by that. I mean, this was just a couple months ago. It was like a kick in the gut. And of course, the first reason it was upsetting was because I don't want to hurt my children above everything. I don't want to be hurting my children. And then, so I was really upset. And then I very quickly just changed my perspective in that situation. And I said, I'm going to give him back his name, and I'm going to choose love.
Yeah.
I talk about choosing love all the time. So I kind of jokingly said, I'm going to choose love, Kathy Love. And it has stuck. And actually my maiden name, Capilupo, means head of the wolf. And the word love means, it comes from the French word for female wolf, known for her bravery and ferocity.
Wow, that's an incredible story. This is why I love doing things like this, because I that was something that kind of crossed my mind, but I don't think it was something that I would have asked. Because it's like on your socials it says Kathy Leckey, but then it says like Kathy Love. So I was like, it's interesting that you say that. And Kathy, I just want to say, like, obviously a lot of the people in the audience have kind of known my story, but like you and I've kind of shared in depth like a lot of our story and things that we've overcome. I grew up with like a single mom, and it was like had to do everything that like my mom couldn't do. And I just want to say, like, from a child perspective, like, you are absolutely like an incredible mom, human. Like, I know you're probably going to say that you were the lucky one, but your kids are so lucky to have you as a mom. And thank you so much for sharing that story. That was really, really powerful. So thank you.
You're welcome. You were talking about when I did the TED Talk, they were actually in the audience.
Wow.
And that was, that ended up being a really pivotal experience, because I was talking about our reality at the time. And up until then, there were people that had no idea what was going on, and it was somewhat of a secret.
Wow.
But after that TED Talk, it was public information. And there was a freedom again in that, of them not having to wonder, do they know? People knew what was going on. And they could tell that if they knew and they were still talking to us, that it was, they knew that we were still good people, kind of thing. There was this validation to it.
Yeah,
But
that was
there was a funny story in there too about the father who didn't want his kids to know. And so he said, we're telling him that your husband went to Europe. And we were like, no, we're telling the truth here.
I remember that. I remember that in the thing. Yeah, that's awesome. Stephen, Kathy, I don't want to spoil anything, but I will be introducing Stephen to you and Scott really soon, and you will be blown away by his story.
Oh,
And
great.
yeah, it's so incredible. I've met so many incredible people on LinkedIn, and I get to do this and interact and learn about people's stories. It really is like incredible. You you had talked about something that for me is kind of like an audio room in the making. Heck, maybe you and I can even kind of do one together. So many times, right? Especially for a lot of people, like for me, I was always used to the one helping other people, that on my latest adventure, it was really hard for me to like ask people for help. But I think even harder for me than asking for help was like learning how to receive it and accept it, right? Because a lot of times when you're so used to like asking, a lot of people, most people will say no, right? It could be like the smallest thing. They're like, yeah, no. And when people actually tell you yes, you're like, oh shoot, like it puts you in like a weird position. I'm kind of curious, can you kind of talk about that a bit for you? Because and I'm curious on your thoughts on this as well, because I in my experience, I believe that it's harder to actually accept help than to actually ask for it. And I'm kind of curious for you, like what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Well, so before, everything hit the fan, we were a family who our whole um, nonprofit was about giving back to the community. I was a volunteer in a million different places. We were all about giving back. And all of a sudden, we lost our jobs, we lost our house, we lost our cars. Um, we lost everything. We were now in a position to be asking or to be receiving. And um, I have to say that asking for something for my kids was easier than asking for myself, which I didn't ask for. Um, I didn't ask for things that we didn't need. We learned very quickly, the kids and I learned very quickly the difference between what you need and what you want. And we had a lot of conversations about that. There were definitely things that they were used to doing, like extra sports and things like that, that they were not able to do. We had a lot of people offering to, like, they paid for their sports. Um, they paid for a sports season. We bought used or free equipment, things like that. And I got used to it. I really did. I made myself be okay with it, knowing, and I knew for sure that I was a very giving person and that I had been giving all my life. And that as soon as I was back on my feet, I'd be giving again. And so I just allowed myself to take that turn, that I let myself know it was okay to just take my turn, and that we are in this cycle and we all give and we all take. And it's not always, the whole pay it forward thing. It's not always paying back to the same person. It's not always an equal amount, but somehow it all seems to work itself out.
Yeah, that was powerful. And one of the things that I learned is you had you had you said something about on your TED talk about it's not really a matter of if, but more of kind of a matter of when. And
Right.
one of the things that I've kind of come to realize is that what we tend to do, especially like in the US, just really speaking from the US, is we tend to kind of compare the different types of like asking for help, right? Like, oh, it's okay to ask somebody to talk or like this, but like, oh, if I have to ask them for money, it's like the worst thing in the world. Or it's like if I need to ask for like health, that like these different categories. And one of the things that I've kind of realized is that we're all gonna have to ask for help at some point. And my whole philosophy behind it is that I would like to hope that when it comes, or if it comes to the point where I need to ask, that somebody would be willing, if I was in their position, that somebody would help me. So that's kind of how I look at it. And I obviously have like so many questions, but I know we're coming up on time. One of my favorite questions that I love to ask people, especially people who've done a lot of like inner work, personal development, a lot of these type of things. There's so many mentors, right? People that you've kind of met along your journey and that have been so impactful for you. But I want to know, like, who's been the most impactful person that you've met on your journey, and what was the most valuable thing that they've taught you?
So a lot of times when people experience a loss, there's this line, and so memories are before that and after that. And that's a little bit how I'm going to answer this question. So when we moved back to Buffalo, when we were really going through it, there was a person that I met, Rob Simonelli, and he was my coach, and he helped me out so that I was able to get his coaching. He was very generous with me, and he taught me about the law of gratitude, the law of I can't think of what they are right now, but there's the laws of the universe, and like kind of the principles of The Secret and visioning. Um, he he taught me a lot about manifestation, and I believe in that, in the ability to be really clear about what you want and working toward those goals. So he was pivotal at that point. And then once I got back to Connecticut is when I met Scott McGregor. Well, actually, that's not true. I was still in Buffalo. I really wanted part of my vision was to get back to Connecticut, and I couldn't figure out how I was going to do it. And I was in therapy. I was crying all the time. I was a mess. I could not figure out how to make this happen. And talking to my therapist at the time, I just got really clear. I said, okay, I really want to get back. So I called Scott because he was doing recruiting through something new, Scott McGregor. And he said, look, I don't have any jobs open right now, or I don't have anything for you, but let's just have a conversation and maybe I can make an introduction for you. And I said, that's perfect. That's all I need. So we have this hour-long conversation. We're just I'm being super open and honest with him because it's not an interview. We're just having a conversation. And at the end of it, he said, well, I didn't see this coming, but I could use your help. And so he hired me, and I started working for him the next day. And that is how I was able to get my family back to Connecticut, because I had gotten that job with him. And so I did. I moved back to Connecticut, and we started working together in 2016. And then in 2020 is when we started the Outlier Project. So we've been working together for 7 years, and so Scott McGregor is that person in the second part.
Wow. Yeah, I love that answer. So I don't want to spoil too much because Scott's gonna, be on the show, but I just want to say that, like, there's people that you meet, and I've met probably like a handful of them so far in my life, that you're just like, man, like, if people can meet one of those people, like, for your entire life, like, you're set, right? And what an incredible story. The Outlier Project for me has been an absolute game changer. I wasn't really necessarily kind of mind blown by the magnitude, because I've kind of been in that world for the past like couple years of, being around like people who are massively successful and this and that. But just the character and the way that they treat people. And I mean, Scott's like probably one of the most thoughtful people that I know, has really just changed my entire perspective on really not only just networking, but building relationships and adding value and being an asset to people and all these type of things. So that was an incredible conversation. Man, so many different places that we could go. I'm really curious for you, Kathy, because at the end of the bio, right, we talked about how you really kind of didn't plan or kind of want to necessarily be a self-care coach, but you're like, hey, you've done this work for yourself. You were like you started being your first client, which is how I've started with anything that I've done professionally. Did you have kind of like an experience or maybe like an interaction that said like, this is like what I want to do, like I want to help people like do this? How did that kind of really come to fruition?
Well, my first job was as a teacher, so I've always been a teacher, and I I'm the kind of person, if I find something that I love, I'm going to share it. So it was hard, it was just natural for me to want to share everything I learned because it had made such a major change in me. But what happened is that when I was in Buffalo, I started working with Matt Pfeiffer. We worked together at a company while he was getting his degree in psychology as a therapist. So as the years went by, we stayed in touch, and he knew everything that I was going through, and he watched me heal. So during 2020, his therapy practice was overloaded. So he called and he asked me if I would start doing some group coaching. And I said, and his specialty was on narcissistic relationships. And I said, I will do the coaching, but it has to be on the healing aspect of it. I don't want to be immersed in the toxicity part. And
Right.
so that's how the coaching started. Was I started talking to these people who were going through some kind of toxic relationship, focused on the healing from codependency, with
Mm,
the with self-care as the solution. And that's how the book came out. Is I had created all these lists on my phone for myself. I started coaching, and I would say, well, make this list, make this list. And then I ended up just putting them into a book, and that's my self-care shit. The work.
yeah. Yeah, that's funny. So I'm kind of curious because it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong on the timeline, but it seems like your journey to navigate the trifecta, as a lot of people call it, is similar to mine. Because I started speaking, and then after I started speaking, then I created my course to like help people achieve success on LinkedIn. And then after I did that, the book for me was kind of the last thing. I'll finish writing it by this year, and it'll get released next year on my 27th birthday. But is that kind of the correct timeline for you as well, like in terms of order? Like you started speaking and then you created your course that kind of is what inspired the book?
So I did this. I did the TED Talk, but at that time I wasn't doing any coaching or anything. So in like kind of current times, I started coaching, and then did the book from the coaching, and now I've been doing keynotes on self-care and healing from codependency.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I know we only have 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that I give you enough time, but I have one more question. You at the latest Outlier project retreat, you were one of the speakers. Talk to me about what that experience kind of was like for you, and what was probably like the biggest takeaway that you've gotten either from like your keynote or from just that entire experience?
Oh, the retreat was really such a magical experience, because we were able to be so vulnerable with each other, because we spent 4 solid days together, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and everything in between. And not just sitting conference style, but able to like say, hey, let's take a ride on the bike, or let's go kayak. So, we did like a nighttime kayak under the stars. I had some of the most beautiful conversations during those times. So when you're with people like that, when you're talking about issues like self-care and forgiving yourself and bringing up these things, it does require a bit of vulnerability and trust in the conversation. And so I really appreciated being able to have those conversations there. But the big kind of my own takeaway is that we're not used to talking about self-care. A lot of entrepreneurs are focused on taking care of everything besides themselves. CEOs are taking care of everything and everyone except for themselves. And so we're not talking about self-care as it relates to business. And we're not talking about what real self-care means. And real self-care in business means you have an idea and you share it because you believe in yourself, because you're in a room where you're respected, where people have healthy boundaries, and you're not going to be, emotionally abused in some way. So self-care and this kind of healing are directly tied to the success of your people and your company, but we're not talking about that.
Yeah, that was powerful. So I want to give you the last 3 minutes. I know for a lot of you, if you've never been on one of our Outlier Project calls, we always end with what can I do or what can we do to support you? So Kathy, I'm going to give you the last 3 minutes to just there's so many wonderful people in the audience who I'm sure have either followed you or sent you connection requests, and just anything that I can do personally as well to support you. Like, who are you trying to connect with? How can I help you elevate and achieve your goals? And I'm going to give you the full screen. So thank you so much for being here. This has been an incredible conversation.
Thank you, Paul. I'm only going to take 1 minute because I have to jump on another live call, actually, that's on Wednesday nights. But all I will say is connect with me. And if you connect with me here on LinkedIn, all of my information, my TED Talk is pinned on my profile. The link to my book is there. But, creating a relationship, just starting a relationship with me is all I can ask for and all I need. So I appreciate you all. Thank you very much for having me and for being on at this time. So I'm going to say goodnight and jump on to my next call.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being here, Kathy. Hope you have an amazing next call and the rest of your Wednesday night. And you've delivered so much value for us. Thank you so much. Have an amazing Wednesday, and I'm sure you and I will see each other soon.
You too, Paul. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Wow, what an incredible conversation that was with Kathy. And, what's so fascinating about these conversations is so many things come up that I had no idea. Like, a lot of the things that came up were things that I wasn't really going to ask her about. And this is why conversation and storytelling and all these type of things that you hear people talk about all the time. This is why it's so powerful, because you never know what part of your story is going to resonate with somebody else, right? Like, Christine had talked about how, wow, like these are all the things that I'm currently either experiencing or that I've overcome. And it's that small piece of your story that could become like a lifelong connection. I mean, who knows what's going to happen with Kathy and Christine and all these, anybody here who has connected with her, and that for me is really my favorite part of LinkedIn that I didn't realize was how things would go, is that I get to connect people, right? I had an incredible conversation today with Ari, and I can't wait to connect her with other people in my network and other really good friends of mine who I feel like they'll hit it off. And you never know, going back to something that we had talked about in the beginning, so many people are one conversation, right? If you're an entrepreneur, if you're a business person, what if I told you were one conversation away from a completely different life, right? Like you have no idea who could be that one person that could completely change it for you. And yeah, I'm so grateful for this show. I'm so grateful for everybody who showed up. Thank you so much for being here. This has been an incredible conversation. And yeah, the next two guests that are coming on this show are going to be epic to close out 2023, which is really when this show started. And I'm just really grateful to have the opportunity, have the conversations, have these type of people in my network that you get to pull on for insight, have conversations, and so incredible. So thank you all so much for being here. Have an amazing Wednesday, and I'll talk to you soon.